So we're doing Justin, then me, and then you, then Maximo will bring it in. That's perfect. Okay, so welcome back to, this is the last session of the day. We're going to run, we're a little bit behind, so we're going to run till 5:45. We've been asked to look at 4 big questions as a panel, and a great panel, by the way. We have 2 people who are sitting, 3 people from university, who are sitting now in universities, but who have held positions before. Joaquim at IFPRI, Justin at the World Bank as chief economist, and then we have Maximo Torero, who's also been head of markets and trade at IFPRI and is now assistant director general and chief economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization. So it's a really nice and very credible group of researchers and that researcher policymaker combination that Mauricio was talking about. We've been asked to answer 4 questions, and you may be selective in your responses. And this time we've asked them to speak 8 minutes, hopefully, and then have a round of discussion and exchange with the audience. So the first question is, what are priority knowledge gaps in the SDG agenda? How and who should set priorities for development research? Third, does research today focus more on what is to be done and less on how it should be done and how to do more of the latter? And fourth, how can development research become more global and universal in its generation and relevance? Is there a role for comparative work, the elusive comparative work? So we'll start with Justin Lin.
Thank you very much. In this meeting, I think we talk a lot about the climate change as a global and shared challenges of sustainable development, and I agree with that. However, I'd like to point to another angle, that is poverty. If we do not eliminate poverty, that's goal number 1 of SDG, then poor people will not have sufficient funds to buy nutrition food. The second one will not be easy to achieve either. And they are poor, they don't have the means to take care of themselves for medicine and so on. Then the third goal cannot be achieved either. So poverty should be a big issue for us. And we know currently poverty is certainly concentrated in low-income countries, especially in Africa. And there's some estimation. By the time of 2030, 80% of the poverty in the world will concentrate in Africa. And currently, the population in Africa is 1.2 billion. And 70% of them age below 30. 20% of them, 50% of them age below 20s. And there's some estimation. By the time of 2050s, the population in Africa will be 2.5 billion. And if the poverty issue does not address, not only the SDG Goal 1, Goal 2, Goal 3 cannot be achieved, I think a social political stability in Africa will be hard to maintain. And poor people will not stay idle in their home country. If they see the poverty in their country and the prosperity in the rest of the world, the migration, legally or illegally, from Africa to Europe and other parts of the world, will be hard to prevent. And those kind of large outflow of poor people from Africa, then it can create social, cultural conflict and causing many instability issue in other parts of the world. So I think how to eliminate poverty in a poor country, and especially today, Africa, would be a common challenge. And we have a shared responsibility to help people in poor countries, and especially in Africa. But All the countries in the world 300 years ago were poor, including the advanced countries today. 300 years ago, they were all poor. And how come today they can be so much advanced with such a prosperity? One thing is that all the poor people live in agrarian economies. And if you want to get rid of poverty, you need to have a structural transformation from agrarian economy to modern manufacturing economy, then gradually climbing the industrial ladder to become service-oriented economies. And there's no exception. For example, my own country, China. 40 years ago, China was a poor country. At that time, the per capita GDP in China was less than 1/3 of the average of sub-Saharan African countries' average, less than 1/3. Certainly, China now is doing quite well. But if you look 40 years ago, 81% of the population in China live in the countryside, rely on agriculture, and China's export, only 75% of China's export are either agricultural product or processed agricultural product. And China could do well in the past 40 years was because of structural transformation. And I can go on and on to look into every successful country is similar. And for the developing country to be able to complete this kind of structural transformation, there's also one thing in common. They all capture the window of opportunity for the global relocation of labor-intensive light manufacturing. Industrial revolution started in light manufacturing. And the United Kingdom certainly led the world on that. But when they move up their income level, they move up to more value-added industries, and other country enters. And European country did that. Successful East Asian country did that. And so to help the African country, we need to expose if there's a window of opportunity for them to grasp, to help them to have this kind of structural transformation. And luckily, China may provide those kind of window of opportunity. Because currently, the per capita GDP in China was about 10,000. And about the time of 2025, the per capita GDP in China likely to be 12,700. China will be a high-income country. And China, in the past 40 years, relied on those kind of light manufacturing to be successful. And China will leave open the window of relocation of those kind of light manufacturing. And currently, China has 85 million people in that manufacturing. And those 85 million jobs will be relocated from China to other low-income countries. And I have some article to show that will be sufficient for all the low-income countries, including African countries, to kickstart their industrialization process. And this is an opportunity we should work together to facilitate African countries to grab their opportunities. But if African countries successfully to industrialize, it's going to be a challenge for the global climate change. Because if they move to the industrialization, CO2 emission and so on will increase substantially because energy intensity will increase substantially in their production. And so if we want to achieve the global climate change target, we also need to find a new way of industrialization by applying green technologies. But we know low-income countries, they do not have ability to innovate those kind of new technologies. So I think a more successful high-income country, they have a responsibility to generate, to innovate, invent those kind of new technologies. And also, currently, most cases, green technology is more expensive than traditional technologies. So we also have a shared responsibility to help the African country and other low-income countries during their industrialization to have access to the new green technology at affordable prices. If we can do that together, that's our remaining challenges and responsibilities. Then we may be able to solve the issue of poverty, and then no hunger, and good health, and a good, climate environment for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Justin, you've laid out very clear priority knowledge gaps and areas for future research in green technology, in prosperity for structural transformation, climate, poverty. Let's now turn to Bina. You're a leader in the field of feminist economics. Tell us how do you see the key gaps? She'll speak from the podium and then sit afterwards.
I don't have a pocket.
See, these speakers are made
So
for
I think
a
this
certain
is,
gender.
well, there you are. I claim the field of development economics as well. So first of all, I want to congratulate GDN on its 20th anniversary. And I feel this because also I've long been associated with GDN. And I feel a bit nostalgic today because I was here in 1999 in Bonn in the first meeting. And I do remember when Joe Stiglitz and Lynn Squire had come to the International Economic Association in Argentina to present the idea of GDN. And then Bob Solow, then president of the IEA, said, Bina, will you attend as our rep the Bonn meeting? And Lynn Squire then asked me if I would be a discussant for GDN's constitution. There was a draft constitution. I must confess I so disagreed with the draft that I wrote and presented my own alternative version. And interestingly, that got widespread report and became the prototype of GDN's first constitution. And one of the clauses in that, particularly the emphasis on democratic functioning, but one of the clauses was that GDN would finally move to a democratic developing country. And thereby hangs a story which Diane Stone also talked about. I was member of GDN's founding board. Samir Madziki is also here, and some of the others. And I helped a bit in its move to India. So I feel a bit of a mother figure, if you like, for GDN, and I'm really delighted to see it grow. And I thank Pierre Jacques and the GDN team for inviting me. So the topic for today, I'll address two of the questions, Amanda. What are globally shared sustainable development challenges, and what are the knowledge gaps that may hamper the pursuit of SDGs? And I'll focus on what I see as both a long-standing and a current development challenge, namely gender inequality in wealth. And that cuts across countries, and what I'll do is I'll cover three aspects. Why do we need to focus on the gender wealth gap as a big global challenge? And why neglecting it will hamper the achievement of many SDGs? Second, what are the knowledge and data gaps that we face in tackling this challenge? And then what are the policy and interdisciplinary challenges in tackling this inequality? So why is the gender wealth gap a key global challenge that we cannot afford to neglect? I hope to persuade you, it's not just Bina Agarwal's favorite theme that I'm talking about, but I hope we can all root for it. And it's important because gender inequality, especially in productive assets, has multiple negative effects that can hamper sustainable development. So to illustrate, if we consider inequalities in immovable wealth, especially land, which is very important in developing countries, inequalities in land ownership in developing countries has been found to have, and there's a huge quantity of research over the past 2 decades and more, of the adverse effects of this. So firstly, the effect would be on food security and agricultural productivity. We know that women are major farm producers globally. More than in 2012, 47% of farm workers in Africa, 43% in Asia, and more than 50% in Southeast and East Asia were female. And their percentages have been growing. But we also know that lack of land ownership reduces their access to inputs, to credit, to technology, to information, and hence to overall agricultural output. Most of you, or many of you, would know an assessment made by the FAO, which assessed that if women had the same equal access to inputs, women farmers as male farmers, we'd have 20 to 30% higher yields and 2.5 to 4% greater agricultural output. Now, you may quibble about the figures here and there, but I think the general idea is very valid. Secondly, we know that insecure land tenure undermines women farmers' ability to take measures for adapting to or mitigating climate change. And that will be true for all small farmers, but especially the more vulnerable women farmers, whether we think of soil conservation or tree plantation and so on. We also have a lot of research that women's lack of productive assets would negatively affect child nutrition, health, and education, all of which are found to be significantly better if the mother possesses assets than if the father alone possesses those assets. And then there's my own research where I found that the incidence of domestic violence was hugely higher where women were propertyless. And the figures were amazing. So I did the study with a colleague in Kerala where the reported physical violence was 49% among propertyless women, no land or house, and 7% if they had both. So basically, we can pile up these examples, but gender inequality in property is a key challenge because it is linked to such a wide range of development and indicators and SDGs. It's linked to SDG 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 13, just as a small list. Poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, inequality in general, and climate change. And I haven't even begun to talk about public wealth like forests and so on. So then we come to measurement. So if we accept this, we face a related challenge. How do you measure gender inequality in wealth? So if I were to ask you, what is the extent, what are the trends of global inequality in wealth, we just have to dip into the works of Tony Atkinson, Thomas Piketty, Branko Milanovic, Francois Bourguignon, Joe Stiglitz, and so on. You'll have a whole range of studies. But the moment you go deeper and ask, how is this well distributed by gender, we draw a blank for most countries. Not only is data sparse, but rather few economists have focused on intra-household wealth inequalities. So in 1994, when I wrote this book of mine, A Field of One's Own, on gender inequality in property across 5 South Asian countries, it did catalyze global interest in the subject, and we have a whole range of empirical studies, including by IFPRI, that have emerged, almost all of them by women economists. Now, these studies, although they are few, show that the inequalities are huge. So, for instance, in Africa, the average figures across 10 countries show that only 39% of landowners are women, including joint owners. In Asia, again, across 5 countries where we have national representative figures, female landowners range between 4 to 32%. In India, where I'm doing currently ongoing work, across 9 states, only 14% of landowners are women, owning only 11% of land. Now, this is 14 years after the inheritance law in India became gender equal for 80% of India's women. Now, we have, again, figures for developed countries are sparse, but they're also revealing, and they show large gender gaps in particular kinds of wealth. So, for instance, if you take pension wealth in the United Kingdom, women's pension wealth is 1/3 of men's from the last figures that I saw. So we have notable data and research gaps in relation to this global challenge. So then we come to policy. Now, of course, gender inequality is a very complex issue to tackle in policy because it's multi-layered, it's embedded in families, in communities, in states, and in markets, and it's mediated by social norms and perceptions, which are not easy to change. So if we just take, say, for instance, if you take a major source of inequality, which is inheritance. Now, gender inequality in inheritance is deeply rooted. So first of all, you would say, well, what are the inheritance laws? Are they unequal? And often they are. They can vary by region and religion and type of property. And inequalities in landed property tend to be the worst. Secondly, we have disabling social norms. So for instance, in Asia, rural women typically move long distances on marriage, which makes it very difficult for them to claim or to manage immovable property. Or they may give up their claims to reduce family conflict in favor of their brothers. And then we have social perceptions as a barrier. So this is much more general. It exists in wealth markets, it exists in labor markets, which is that men are seen as the main breadwinners for families and hence as much more deserving of property, especially land, than women, who are not seen, who are still seen as dependents. And of course, then you have legal institutions. You may be less aware of your claims, you have less resources to take up the legal challenge. And then, of course, if you go beyond inheritance, the inequalities multiply, since women have much lower earnings to purchase land or a house. And this is really global. I mean, the gender wage gap, the gender earnings gap has been hugely talked about in research, and it exists both in developing and developed countries. So then one can ask, well, what is the way forward? Do the SDGs provide a way forward? So for instance, if you look at SDG 5, which is gender inequality, it mentions in 5A women's rights in land as a target. So that's pretty important, you'd say, but then it's restricted. So what does it do? It says that, yes, women should have access to land by inheritance, but even this is diluted by the clause in accordance with national laws. So it's eliding precisely that may need changing, namely national laws to be made gender equal. And this leaves a loophole for governments to bypass the goals mandate. Moreover, SDG 5, of course, makes no mention that you need to increase women's access to property and land via markets and government transfers. So you need to go beyond the SDGs to take up this global challenge. So let me conclude, therefore, that gender inequality in property is a global challenge, and to meet this, we need to fill at least 4 gaps. Firstly, conceptual gap. We must pay attention not only to inter-household inequality, but also to intra-household inequality. This needs a conceptual shift. Secondly, of course, data gaps. We need gender disaggregated data on all forms of wealth. I've been saying this since the late 1980s, some of you as well. And then there are disciplinary gaps. Now, I know that in the previous session, there was a brief mention of it. We must go beyond economic measures. So for instance, if you want to look at inequality in property, you do need to understand law. So there is a synergy between understanding laws and the economic measures. But also to understand the social constraints, you need to read a bit of anthropology. I think it would do most economists, most of us who are here who are economists, to really do some anthropological work. Just sit down, go to a village, and spend a month or more, there. And then finally, of course, there are policy gaps. And I think I'm going to end with this, that we really need to build synergies between this global challenge and other national and international goals. And that would really do wonders for fulfilling other SDGs and not just SDG 5. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bina. Okay, so far, our panelists have focused on the priority knowledge gaps, but don't forget the second questions that we asked, which is how and who should be setting priorities for research based on those big problems and issues that you've identified. But let's turn now to Joaquin.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. I'm afraid I also need to reminiscent a little bit about history. I was here 20 years ago when GDN started. I congratulate the GDN players for what has happened in the 20 years. The excitement in the room 20 years ago was tremendous, and that was carried on through various other GDN meetings. Gives me also pleasure to sit next to a mother of the framing of the GDN Code of Conduct, who happens to be a member of my board, the Center for Development Research, and I think, Maxim, you were the only one who won the GDN award twice. So to the young scholars in the room, we should not only look at growth of the institution and its impact. I think the big impact GDN made was through its brains that diffused the development process and had an impact through their being and their teaching, etc. The SDGs, in my opinion, are a frame for our applied problem-solving research for the next half decade or decade. We, however, need to think beyond the SDGs because development research takes time, and it takes time to come from research results to policy diffusion and impact. The SDGs, we should not be sad about, practically don't mention research. If you do a word search, you find, I think, the word research 3 times and science 3 or 4 times in marginal, inconsequential positions. So, as I said, we should not be depressed about that science and research are forgotten in the text. What would you expect from diplomats and development practitioners? They think about solutions, but we are called to task to really look at implementation issues, coherence, incoherences, and to deal with the opportunities which the SDGs offer us. When I say we need to look beyond, the SDGs do not offer broad-based transformative recipes, and they do also not offer broad system innovations. The SDGs will only be achievable if we focus on innovations, institutional and the opportunities of technological innovations. The biosciences just as much as the information and communication technologies. We will, I think, do deliver on the SDGs if we follow a few of the how opportunities. I come to your call to action on the hows. I would like to make 5 comments on the how we should proceed. The first one, I think, is what you expect from an academic who teaches doctoral students. By the way, since SDG 1, 20 years ago, we just had founded the Center for Development Research here in Bonn. More than 500 doctoral students left our center all over the world and teach now tens of thousands of young people. Who set the agenda of these doctoral students? It happened bottom up. It happened bottom up. They come with ideas, pursue their ideas, don't follow their professors' ideas, have selective listening, improved their skill capabilities, and this 500 flowers blooming approach I find extremely important. It depends on freedom of choices of topics and of agenda. Bonn University has just gotten a big award from the federal government, has become one of the 11 excellence initiatives. We, of course, follow a second different approach as a university with its partners, including the United Nations agencies here. We established 6 major priority areas, and one of these priority areas is called Innovation and Technologies for Sustainable Futures, plural futures. A colleague and myself are coordinating this area, and it has a set of agenda items which probably all of us would be able to quickly agree on. It has stuff on innovation and digitization, mobility and migration, conflict issues, and closer to the SDGs, transformative innovations and research, and bioeconomy. So that's the second approach. And the third approach of how I think is the interaction between academia, society, governance, government, NGOs, and the corporate sector. Let me point at an interesting example how academia is going in that direction. The recently founded, only 4 years ago, founded Inter-Academy Partnership, that's a collective of the 130 academies of science in the world, have gone through a 3-year process to define the science agenda for and innovation agenda for food, nutrition, and agriculture. So daring to say what to do bottom up in the 4 hemispheres and then globally, I think was an interesting task. Therefore, I suggest, and as we interacted a lot with policymakers in this process, I would argue against grouping the actors into the eggheads and the politicians, the academia and the implementers. Like Bina said in an intervention earlier, we all can wear different hats. My fourth point, and last but one, is we need to focus on implementation research. That's where socioeconomists can learn a lot from the public health and medical profession. They cultivated the science of implementation research. I'd be happy to come back on that. And lastly, let's not forget that development research needs to unearth causalities. Unless we focus on deep causalities and not only on superficial trends, tendencies, etc., we will have no long-term impact. Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, Maximo, final intervention.
No, thank you. And it's great to be here. I am a product of GDN in a certain way, and most of my work, which initially was on social exclusion and discrimination in gender and other types of discrimination, and my work on infrastructure and complementarities of infrastructure with Francois and Joachim. I think we're part of the panel when it was selected. So it's great to be here and great to see that GDN is doing well and moving forward. So let me start with, my comments are in 2 blocks, and I know I have only 8 minutes. So the first one is reality check, which I think has been already referred to. SDG 1 is crucial for me. SDG 2 is also crucial, but all the SDGs are interlinked, and that's why they are called sustainable development goals. So sustainability is part of it. If I am not in $7 a day per capita, it will be very difficult to continue with SDG 1. I will go back to SDG 1 later on, and I won't be able to comply with it. But SDG 2, which is the priority of FAO right now, basically looks at hunger, and the fact is that it's no longer decreasing. It's in 11% for the last 3 years, so we are not seeing the correct path that we want. Not only that, if we look at quality of food and all forms of malnutrition, we have not 121 million people, but 2 billion people that are suffering what we call moderate food insecurity. And although child stunting is lowering down, it's not going at the rate that it's supposed to go to accomplish the indicator. That means it's off track. And then we have the problem of overweight and obesity, which I don't like to talk too much about it, but it's a pretty important problem, which is creating significant cost to the governments, and is linked to another part of the system, which is the financial part, where normally ministries of finance won't look at it because they don't bring to the present the value of the cost of that. They basically look year by year because the duration of a minister of finance in developing countries is sometimes less than a year. So why they will care about 10 years from now? And you have a contradiction, which is food losses, which we just came out with a number, which is on food losses, 13.8%, which is around $400 billion. So a lot of inconsistencies, which open a lot of what we should do and how we can resolve that. And linked to the sustainability part, we are basically right now crossing 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries in areas which are uncertain, and we don't know how they will escalate, if they will become non-linear, and that could create even bigger problems. So why is this happening, and how we can think on what to do and how to react to this? So the first thing, I don't think is too difficult to figure out that incentives are not well aligned. And let me just take the case of agriculture. So we keep talking about nutritious food and all forms of malnutrition, but all the subsidies are going to staples and not to other types of commodities. Now, if we do simulations of what will be the effect of switching some of those subsidies from one type of commodity to another type of commodity, a more nutritious commodity, we will observe significant well-being improvement. So it's optimal to switch, but we don't do it. Inconsistency in policy, but there are logics behind that. No? Not only like if we look at availability of food, we have food available. That's not an issue. But if we look at the prices, research that Adelman and others have done in IFPRI, the access and the price index that they developed shows that to buy food in Africa with nutritious content is 4 times or more expensive than to buy it in North America. So again, it's not an issue of available food in the world, it's an issue of the access and the quality of food that we need and how the food is not moving in the way it should be moving and how we can resolve that problem. So that opens an important issue of thinking on what research we need to bring up. Why that mobility is not happening is just trade or something else, is infrastructure? Not necessarily. A lot of the reasons why food is not moving in Africa is because of non-trade barriers, not necessarily because of infrastructure and trade agreements. Now, if we look at private versus public good, because if we assume and believe what Adam Smith said in terms of the invisible hand, is that working? Clearly it's not working. And the reason why it's not working is because we have market structural unevenness, externalities, and we are not in a perfect competitive model in the world. And also the rational choice is not there. We don't know preference very well. Now we know that preference could vary depending on your income level. It could vary depending on the level of stress you are. So this idea of rationality is very questionable today. So we need to change the way we are thinking and the way we are optimizing. And let me give you a simple example in terms of what is happening in terms of the case of climate. So every country did a commitment in COP21. So for example, New Zealand is trying to produce less cattle to be able to achieve that commitment. Now, that is very costly because New Zealand is already in the frontier of how to become very efficient in producing cattle in terms of reduction of emissions. So I'm going to make New Zealand to produce X% less of cattle, while that cattle will be increased in some other place, which is not producing it efficiently. So instead of pushing New Zealand out of the production of cattle, which they are in the frontier in terms of emissions, of reduction of emissions, why don't trade those emissions with other country in Africa, for example, which is producing very inefficiently the same cattle? And why we don't create this market of trade of emissions, which Kyoto allowed to do that, but we are not doing it. So it's kind of distorting the way we are seeing and how investments are happening to commit in silos again. We are committing in silos at each country, and we're not allowing to us to think in a system way, because the problem of climate is a global problem. It's not a problem of New Zealand or a problem of Kenya or a problem of Peru. So we need to think in that way, and that is breaking the silos, which I think is really important. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily to do everything multidisciplinary and so on and so forth. It means to play with intensities of how I can combine science with socioeconomic, economics, anthropology to be able to come up with the solutions I need in each of the different elements. So I think we need to change a little bit the way we think into that. And then another topic which is central is the tools that we are using, which are not developed yet in the way they should be developed. We have very little tools to understand uncertainty. And what climate is bringing to us is bigger variance, bigger extreme situations. And we don't have the tools to do that design and to analyze what will happen under deep levels of uncertainty. So what to do, and let me finish on that. For me, there are two things. In the short term, we need to figure out how we can measure these trade-offs between the different SDGs. That's central. And the trade-offs are very difficult to measure. And we need to do research to do that. Because if I am going to do the transformation you are saying, or I am going to do the increase in production in agriculture, I know today, in terms of food, I will be able to do it, but not in terms of cattle. I need to increase the herd size to be able to achieve the 2030 demand. Now, increasing herd size means more emissions. So how I do that technological shift? What is the trade-off that I'm going to do? How I'm going to use better my natural resources? So break silos and think in terms of trade-offs, I think is a different way. It's thinking like in the second derivative, I think is more important. Based on that, we can prioritize packages and we can optimize the way we make decisions and we can create sequencing. And still we are not doing that. Like the work I won for SDGs, for the GDN was on complementarity of investment on infrastructure. Up to now, I have not seen any paper using RCTs or whatever looking at that topic. And it's extremely important because what we found was that the returns of complementarity was a lot higher than individual investments. But I have not seen any evolution in those type of topics. Then we need to find ways in which we use data in a better way. So later today in the evening, there was a panel looking at data, and they said there is a lot of data. Yes, there is a lot of data, but it's not interlinked. I have enormous, amazing data on water, on soil maps, and so on and so forth, and when we try to link it through codes, it's impossible to link it. They have different projections. So we need to find ways in which we use the data we have better and to increase the efficiency of the data we have. Many of the National Institute of Statistics are producing data that is useless. Nobody is using them in their countries. So it's not an issue of more money for data necessarily. It's an issue of being more efficient in the data we produce and reducing inefficiencies we have today. Because they keep doing what they were doing in the 70s, and the world has changed a lot. So we need to find ways to do that. Now, in terms of medium and long term, I think, and it's something that donors don't like, but we need to invest in global tools. We are making decisions today on climate, on food security, on crucial topics, using models that use elasticities of the 70s. And there is no investment in improving the way we measure those coefficients, technical coefficients, those elasticities. And we are making decisions based on that. All the scenarios that you are looking, the IPCC scenarios, all the work that many of the models do are based on elasticities which are outdated completely, and on realities that are completely different to the realities we face today. I think we need to think out of the box. People, and technology will not necessarily resolve that. People are talking about text mining. And it's great. Today I can evaluate 6,000 papers in 1 hour through text mining. But these are papers of the past. These are papers that were done on a different reality. And these are not papers that necessarily will give me a solution for the future. So for me, using parameters of papers of the past are not necessarily relevant for the future. So I need to be careful how I use technology. And finally, I think we need to increase transparency of the information. That's the only way we can use data better, and improve the incentive design. And when we look at incentives, for example, I can give incentives to reduce the use of water on agriculture, but the thing that will happen is that our water will be used in a higher paying sector, like mining, which could create a different environmental problem. So how we optimize the system, I think, is the important issue, and that's where the trade-offs question come up.
Thank you, Maximo. So we'll turn to the audience in a moment, but I think good intervention. I want to ask all of you, based on, you've set out some priorities from your perspective, and the way that the research agenda really needs to change given sustainable development goals, but also much else, just because realities have changed so much. What does that mean for the way that development research is financed today? You know, is it sufficient? Is it deployed to the right places? How would you like to see a GDN or others in this field evolve? You know, in many ways, a lot of research, for example, is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the government of Germany. So how do you see their investments changing in the future to reflect these changing needs? Maybe we'll start with you, Joaquin, since you're making eye contact.
Oh, we'll be careful with eye contact.
Don't look at me. No.
Amanda, I think your question has a difficulty to delineate what do we mean by development research. And if you refer to the research funded out of development agencies or foundations, yes, we have a few players there, but this is only a tiny fraction of what I would define as relevant development research and related science. The overall basket of science and development relevant research funding has vastly improved in the last 20 years worldwide. Not only in absolute terms, but even in relative shares of government budgets and GDP shares. I suggest we look at the overall spending and resource mobilization on innovation financing. And that is relevant for us. I think we would self-marginalize our community of development researchers if we look at the pots of money which has the label development on them. So having said that, I'm very optimistic that research that focuses on innovation and change and facilitates improvement in livelihoods is better endowed. And maybe we need to redefine what we mean by development and not call it the development aid-related research only, which is also important. Looking from a European and from a German perspective, I come out with these positive and optimistic perspectives. I would add that the initiatives which come from this private and semi-private sector, so the foundations and private sector research, which has increasingly, the corporate sector has increasingly started to focus on sustainability issues. Look at the whole big investment of the private sector in becoming more climate adapting and climate conscious. Also, the social responsibility, small window dressing units of 20 years ago in the corporate sector have become audited serious efforts. So defining our agenda so broad makes me optimistic.
Okay. Well, I'm going to come to you next to understand what you're thinking from your perspective, but just to say that at the Center for Global Development, some colleagues of mine looked at UK research and development spending tagged as overseas development aid. And they found a very weak link. This is just a way to fund universities, but a very weak link to development per se. Okay, and very few non-UK institutions that receive that funding. So just to give you a little counterpoint, although it's true that the amount of funding to that use has boomed, the way that it's being implemented might be a concern. But let's hear from you, Justin.
Well, I'm a funder for several development research institutions in my own country. And I'm struggling with fundraising. That's my main job.
Yeah.
And so that proves we don't have sufficient fund for supporting development research. But from what I see, the total amount of funding certainly is insufficient. But it's very also to look into the composition of funding supports. And I think in that regard, it's more challenging than the total amount of funding. Because mostly the funding was used to support research topics which are considered important from outside world, from the developed country. And to carry out the research according to the theoretical models that generated from the developed countries. And we did not really pay attention to the research about the experiences of developing country success and failure themselves. And to generate new ideas, new theoretical framework from the developing country. I think that's more challenging than the total amount of funding. And those type of research actually is much more underfunded than research themselves. Because in the developing country, certainly, in terms of the skill, technology of the researcher today, improve a lot.
Yes.
But in general, they are hired by multilateral development institutions for working for the World Bank, IMF, or other development institutions, and they follow the research topic mandated by them, and use the theoretical framework that used as in the high-income countries, and otherwise it's very hard for them to publish their paper or to be accepted. So I would say it's very important not only to increase the funding, but also very important to give more support to the developing country researchers. They try to look into their own experiences and generate the new ideas, new theoretical framework, and that will make the theory or research more relevant or more helpful to the developing country.
So that unearmarked money with priorities set by the many flowers blooming that you described, that's possible in terms of the way that funding is organized in Germany, for example. Bina, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. This is working, yeah, okay. So let me add a couple of additional points. One is that there's been a tendency for development research to funding, to actually say that these are the countries, if you're doing research on these countries, we're going to fund you. And so they move to the countries which they see as perceived as having problems, with no money available to do research where there are solutions. So for instance, if you say we're only going to fund research in developing countries, but maybe there are some solutions which exist in developed countries, you are not going to get funds for that. I'll give you an example. So I'm currently researching group farming, which is small farmers pooling their resources, all their resources, and to see if there's an alternative model of farming. And I found that there are examples in France. It's very, very, very difficult. It was totally impossible, very difficult to get funds to work on France, because we should be working on a developing country. But if you actually look at, so suppose you take the example of Ellen Ostrom's work. She looked at irrigation systems, which are both in the north and the south, and she looked at forests and so on, various systems, and from that she drew principles which could be applied globally. So I think policy also requires theory building to move from the very specific example to much broader understandings of the principles on which you should build an institution, institutional innovation, if you will. And that's only possible if you have much more freedom to draw examples for both historically and currently, globally. And I don't see development research, the research funders recognizing that. The second is the dominance, I think I raised this in my previous intervention, is that the concentration of funding to institutions seen as institutions of excellence, which are predominantly in the north, also means that those ideas get huge amounts of exposure. And you take a research paper of a doctoral student who hasn't published it yet. It'll already be presented in 10 different conferences. It'll be there in draft. It'll be in working paper form. Sometimes those ideas are just incorrect. Sometimes those ideas are not relevant. Those are not presented to the audiences or the countries to which they relate. I'm not talking about Joachim's institution, which is exceptional, or his doctoral students, but I'm simply saying that it is, ideas are driven also by concentrations of knowledge power. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because of course you want excellence, but should it be concentrated? Shouldn't it be? Is there a way? So I'm just putting this out as a challenge, that we need to think about this. I come back to the example of diverse methodologies, and I do remember when RCTs broke new ground and they became, if you see, just Google gold standard, and that's all that will come up. Now, why is that a gold standard? We saw Joe Stiglitz, we saw Angus Deaton write about, talk about it. That is one of a range of methodologies which could be useful. But that's not how it became. Every donor that I know of many years ago was funding research if you did an RCT. So I'm simply saying that maybe it's moved, but the power of funding to promote only certain and therefore exclude other ideas, methodologies, etc., is very strong. And again, I think we need to then talk about how can it be broadened to the benefit of a diversity of ideas, of 100 ideas blooming, if you like.
Yeah. Well, certainly diversity in rigorous research methods is needed, right? And
I just add one small thing, which is that funding needs to build in time for the researcher to reflect, to take it to diverse forums, and maybe make it policy relevant. Because otherwise, you're so pressured as a researcher that you barely get your research out in journals, and then you're on to something else. Excellent. So that needs to be really, that space needs to be built in of intellectual freedom and space, time, to say, okay, let's reflect. It's risky, maybe nothing will come of it, but I think that space needs to be there. It's closing up, and we do need it.
Absolutely. Okay, Maximo, final, then we're coming to you, the audience.
Okay, so look, I think there is a difference between the stock and the flow in terms of research. I think you need a critical mass of a stock to be able to do these marginal increases. And that's where I see that we need to think bottom-up, but regionally, more aggregated levels rather than just specific countries. Of course, countries can build their own capacities, and governments can invest on that. They can invest in building human capital. They don't need donors for that. They can do it themselves. But we need to think how we can create the critical mass from bottom-up and try to build them. And I think what I observed with China, for example, I was telling Justin, I went to China 10, 15 years ago, then I went 5 years ago. In the economics world, they are shifting it. They are completely now getting close to a frontier. But on the other hand, they are still not innovating out of the box, which is what they need. And that's where it could be that the critical mass is reaching to a point that you can start doing that. But that's very important. So the stock and flow is important. The second thing where I think is this dilemma with the donors is the link between policy and research and development. So they invest, and countries invest in research and development, as Joaquin was saying, but they don't trust too much the policy side. And that's where we need innovation, because in agriculture, I can create a new variety, but if I don't have the market and the market access to deploy, and I don't have the behavioral analysis to how to do extension, then I don't get the profits of that research and development, which a lot of millions were invested. So we need to find a way to link that in policy. But also, it's very important, and that's where I got really surprised in my experience in the last years, is how little the evidence that we know works is being used in the moment of making the final decision of signing the loans, and so on and so forth. And it's not used in both ways. It's not used by the MDB, the multilateral agency, but it's not also used by the countries to press the MDBs to do what they are supposed to do. So I think it's also important to find ways to communicate better the evidence so that it's properly used. And a good way to do it is to show inconsistencies, to show how evidence is saying something and we are doing the opposite. And that is happening in many sectors. So trying to create that link is also important. And temporality, I think, is also central. The donors today have a different temporality. The governments have a different temporality. And it's true that for research, we need time. And to get the results, we need time. But they cannot wait for us to do it. So that is linked to the stock and flow. So we need to be able to have the capacity to be moving in parallel in a different time dimension, but at the same time being able to respond to the short-term dimension that they need. If not, we are not useful. And therefore, we lose the potential of the other time dimension to be able to accumulate the knowledge and stock. And don't forget that the one who signs the check in the government is the Ministry of Finance. So economists could be useful because we need to influence those guys to sign the checks that we need to do the research that we need.
Okay, thanks for those provocative and interesting thoughts. So let's go to you. Let's collect 3 comments. Please say who you are at the start. Here. Is there someone with a microphone?
Yes.
Okay, come on.
I'm surprised about the discussion all over the day, because it focuses a lot on development and research for development, but where is the environmental sustainability? And for instance, when I see global and shared challenges of sustainable development, then we should talk about completely wrong developed high-income countries and how to gain a common purpose that everybody has the right or the same right for an equal footprint. And I think if we continue like this, we will never achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
So I think that goes back to this idea of a universal agenda where there's not development aid or specific countries. Now the issue is convincing research funders in this space to share that view. Second comment? Right here. Raise your hand.
Thank you very much. My name is JiaBin Huang from the African Economic Research Consortium. I was intrigued by Professor Brown's also comment about implementation. I think this is where we miss out. And then I remember this debate in Kenya, for example. Everybody came up and said, oh, we make good policies, the problem is implementation. And then you find the other of course, opposing groups saying that if there were good policies, why were they not implemented? So you go into a chicken and egg game. And I recall also Shanta Devarajan edited a volume with the AERC and the World Bank that was looking at aid and reforms in Africa. And they argued that actually the episodes of implementation actually were accompanied by a crisis. It took a crisis for the government to take serious action and actually implement the policies. So in a sense, the policies are there. What is lacking? One, and that's the second point about the research output, is actually having policymakers who are knowledgeable and well-informed. That is what will make which will make a difference. And that's the point I made in the morning, that actually when we increase a critical mass of perhaps informed policymakers, we are actually going to see that they can evaluate the good and the bad policies or even the implementation speed. But at the same time, it also takes courage, in actual facts, actually to read a policy implementation debate, because essentially, or even a policy implementation platform, because the political economy of policy making in some countries is actually very, very diverse. And it doesn't matter whether it is development policy, it is actually cuts across all forms of policies. There is something to consider the political economy of policy making or even in policy implementation.
Okay, thank you. Third, right there.
Thank you, and thanks for the panelists. I have two small questions. One regarding the role of ODA, the Official Development Assistance, that most developing countries funds come through this. So whether there will be a room for challenging directly some of these to research that will answer some of these questions regarding to GDN. The second, I second the idea of self-selection bias in research and funding. Particularly, I mean, the funder will have some questions that we want to answer. And so we challenge the fund to research centers and research people who can provide answers to those questions. And that will lead research centers from developing countries and others try to position themselves in place or research areas that will be conducive to funding from development. So that type of dichotomy needs to be somehow to be addressed and to be broken somewhere.
Thank you. Okay, let's turn back to our panelists. So the first question is a little bit about, are we really just talking more of the same, especially when we term it development research? Should this be reframed, and what would be the value proposition there? A second question about implementation research and political economy. And third, what does it mean for the GDN itself when we think about this, among other points that you made? So who wants to start? Justin?
Well, I'd like to take on the first two questions. Certainly, we need to do research on the environmental sustainabilities. But in my opening interventions, I also mentioned about social, humanitarian sustainabilities. We cannot separate these two. And so for the SDG, from what I see, the way to achieve that is to have a structural transformation with new technology. And certainly, we need to improve our knowledge about that to make that happen, and to grasp the new opportunity that available from emerging market economies like China or even India and so on. That's the first thing. And the second thing about the implementation, the observation is right. Many countries would not implement the policy recommendations from the multilateral development institutions. Only the time they have the crisis, and they will implement that. That observation is right. But the question is that, after they implement those kind of recommendations, do they really improve their development performance or not? And my hunch is that actually also not. And so that comes into the first question. Do we really have a good policy recommendations for the developing country? And in my second intervention, I already questioned that. Because most of the policy recommendations based on the experiences and the theories from the advanced country. And for those kind of theories generated from the experiences in the high-income country. And so in their theory, they explicitly or implicitly take the structural institution history value in their theories. And when you use the theory as a framework to see the developing country, you can see a lot of distortions based on those kind of theory. And they make a recommendation for the policy changes, but those kind of policy often may not work because in the developing country, their structure, their institution, their culture, and so on are different. And as a result, they are reluctant to implement those kind of policies. And even they implement, again, the performance will not improve. And so that's my plea. We need to support more development research generated from the developing country. In this regard, the idea of GDN is right, to bring the research to the developing country, to encourage the researcher in the developing country to do the research. But I think the mission only achieved 50%. It brings the research to the developing country. But those kind of researchers in the developing countries still use the theory in the North to do their research. And also to do the research what are considered as important from the North. And not really trying to generate a new idea, new theories from the experiences of the developing country. And this is the second half, the DDN and the global research development community need to support the developing country.
Thank you. Maximo?
Yeah, on the first question, that's what I was referring to, the trade-offs in terms of what are the consequences of things, and especially how we can at least optimize the allocation of resources from the situation of the inequalities that we face today at the global level. So my example of New Zealand with an African country was trying to get that benefit, because the African country will benefit from that investment that is too costly to do it in New Zealand when we implement it in Africa, and we can discuss about that. But there are, of course, historical costs that's a different story, and that's something that we need to take into account, but those are there. But in practical terms, today, the way policies are being implemented are pretty inconsistent to the reality, and they are not achieving what we expect. Now, in terms of the implementation and the theory, I think the implementation is a problem. I don't think it's a problem of the countries, honestly. Being from a developing country and being involved in how ministers make decisions, sometimes they have the correct policy and they have reviewed properly the evidence. And the problem comes from the policies being forced by other entities, conditional on loans and so on and so forth, which not necessarily are even consistent with what their own research is saying to do. A very simple example is what happened in the food crisis. Most of the MDBs were implementing policies that were contradictory to what their evidence have shown to them, like, for example, subsidies to fertilizers, which create a lot of emissions, which create a problem, fiscal problems, and they call it smart subsidies, which they had nothing of smart. And countries didn't want to implement them. They wanted to do something else, but the loans were rushed in that direction. So I think we need to keep a balance in terms of don't blame countries. I don't think countries are to be blamed here. On the contrary, sometimes they want to do correct things and they cannot do it because of the way the mechanisms operate. On the other hand, what you were referring to, the theory, and honestly, I don't think it's an issue of the theory of the North and the theory of the South. I think it's an issue that we need to renew our theory. Yeah, the theory was built initially where there was more money and therefore they developed. But I think our theory has a lot of problems right now. We are based on assumptions that are no longer relevant. And we need to do a joint effort to try to improve it. And it has to come from both the North and the South. So South-South, North-North, North-South, whatever it has to do, but we need to improve our theory. So I wouldn't segment it in that way. I would prefer to come with a better public good and share it, and we can learn from it.
But maybe addressing some of the inequities in the system as it stands right now, right, which is the concentration in many developed countries. Joaquim, and we'll finish with you.
On implementation research, which Professor Ndungu asked about, let me give you an example. If you want to reduce infant mortality or maternal mortality, and ask yourself about implementation, the implementation research would scrutinize the incentive structure of all actors involved. And it's a focus on actors, rather than treating black boxes and looking at, broadly speaking, the public health sector. I think we can apply that actor and incentive research to a lot of issues before us. And the GDN community, I think, would be very well positioned to get deeply into implementation research. A comment on the first issue, the ecological problems and our response as a development research community. I think we need to have our ears on the ground on what's happening. And I'm actually quite impressed what in the last 5 to 10 years has happened with, in many countries, shifting their strategies towards a more sustainable, a bio-based economy, a circular economy. More than 50 countries have written themselves, for instance, bioeconomy strategies. That's driven by new science insights, the environmental concerns, and people's preference changes. I think the development research community has been bypassed by this big trend, a big global trend. And it's not just high-income countries, it's middle-income countries and also emerging low-income country economies. So I think we need to have our ears on the ground and help such processes, such transformative processes along with good forward-looking research to pave the way.
Right. Yeah,
It's on.
It's on, yeah, okay. I guess you meant not equalizing footprints, but really reducing footprints. But but then, it raises all the sorts of questions which we've been debating before the Kyoto Protocol, if you like, which is the historical inequality in people's footprints, the idea that large populations don't necessarily mean, in an aggregate sense, larger footprints if you're very low, poor consumers, and all of that. So I think there is a whole debate in Europe on degrowth, I know. And you can't sell it to developing countries because of the link between growth and poverty reduction, if you like. That's how planners think. But what we can begin to talk about is what the content of that growth is. What are the products we produce? What is it? Are we moving towards sustainable consumption? And so on. So it seems to me a footprint idea, of course, is a very general idea, but when we really begin to think of policy action, we need to think about sustainable development and sustainable consumption. So I'm sure you'll agree with all of that. And inequalities, we talked about inequalities. You're right, we didn't use all these. We didn't really use the word environment that much in our presentations, but I think embedded in that is that all sorts of outcomes are stymied if you have serious, huge inequalities between countries, within households, and so on. So I think we'll need several panels to unpackage all of that. There's one small point I want to make on this because it bothers me. And Lee will, which is that people say, well, consumption in India and China is changing as income rises. So I just want to make a small plea for India. Just looking at the figures, is that two things. One is that about 30% people are still vegetarian. So if there is a difference between the carbon footprint of what you actually consume There is a big difference. Secondly, people move towards, Joachim and you might confirm that people in India move to fish and chicken rather than to red meat as incomes rise. So I think that is a big difference in relation to China or the United States. And that needs to be factored in when we are clubbing countries together. They should be unclubbed. The second, very quickly, because a lot has been said and I agree with, on implementation. Just three small things. Firstly, that implementation is always political. It is a political process. Yes, maybe crisis, but even in crisis, governments don't necessarily act. They depend on what they think their populations, whether they vote for them or not, will want and see. And that's always very difficult for researchers, that you may say something and say something and say something, and people are staring at it and not listening to it. The second is trust. We talked about it a bit. I think trust in the research findings on who's saying it. And here I come back and agree with with Alan's point that you must publish rigorously so that it's seen as dependable findings. And then we must find the time to take that to policymakers, change your hats around. But both those hats are very necessary. And third, just talking about the media, I think the media can play a very big role. And independent media can play a very big role in pushing and for grounding both the kinds of problems and the potential solutions. We must constantly see what are the spaces by which media can remain independent. It's becoming less and less independent, even in countries where it was independent. And here money plays a big role. Where do you get your ads? What are the political parameters of freedom and so on? Which are the larger questions we haven't talked about that much, but which are certainly part of a development debate.
Okay, well, thank you to the panelists. Is our time up at 5:45? Okay, so with that, we'll conclude. I think one thing that's interesting, though, is that, between the time that the Global Development Network was started and now, there's probably been increasing siloization of the research effort, at least when we talk about development research, just coming from the health field. There's just an enormous amount of money in health. But for different kinds of research, and I guess one question is, if we're going to go back now to this more integral, sustainable development vision, should it be the Global Sustainable Development Network at least? And then how R&D investments are conceptualized and invested. Does it include social science or doesn't it? I think these are sort of open questions, and then how do we know if it's really contributing to the sustainable development cause or policies and things like that. But thanks so much for a great conversation to the panelists and to the audience for your great questions. Thank you.